the count. Any vote that came in after Election Day will not be counted. We've been saying this over the course of the last few days, George, but I have to say it again. There is nothing illegal, nothing wrong about these votes being counted. This is the democratic system working exactly as it should. It is supposed to take this long, given the historic nature of this pandemic that we are living in right now. And then you've got this sort of contradicting version of reality from the president's own campaign, because while he's saying stop the counting, they've got legal action in places like Arizona where they want to keep the counting going and see the counting happen with their own eyes. Campaign officials were pushed on this today. They say the president meant that any vote that comes in legally is what he wants to see counted, but that is not what he said. And they made it very clear. They say America, his critics, the media, they say, counted Donald Trump out before. They should not count him out right now. They say he is very much alive and well and running in this race. That's the view from the camps. Tom Yamas, let's remind everybody what the paths are to victory for each candidate at this point. All right, we're going to explain basically what Mary just said. We'll put it up on the map for you. For the purpose of this segment, we're going to give Alaska to President Trump. We haven't projected that yet, but he's likely to win that state. So let's talk about Joe Biden's path. As Mary said, if he wins Arizona, look at his electoral total, 264. 270. All he needs is those two states, but there's another path for him as well. If he can just win the state of Pennsylvania, 20 electoral votes, you can see his number. It's 273, George. Okay, and let me bring that to Nate Silver now. Nate, let's talk about the states that are still outstanding right there. Let's start with Pennsylvania. That's where the Biden campaign, they don't want to count their chickens, but that's where they appear most confident right now.
Yeah, look, the vote is very heavily for Biden in Pennsylvania because there are mail ballots that are coming in. So even in red counties where you have mail votes, they tend to be much more Democratic. You also have a lot of votes in Philly, including some Election Day vote. You have provisional ballots that's mostly Democratic. So it's very blue. I think in some ways of all 5 of these states that are outstanding, even though Biden's behind in Pennsylvania, it might be the one where he is most confident about eventually pulling ahead.
Okay, hold on a second there, because I want to go to Steve Osunsami in Georgia, who's got some news. They've been having press conference from the Secretary of State and other officials this morning that race is tightening in Georgia. Steve, what can you tell us?
Hey, I'm not...
We'll come back to Steve. Nate, let me finish with you right now. Let's go now to the state of Georgia. I was just going to talk to Steve Osunsami about that. It has been tightening overnight, and there are still some Democratic counties out there.
Yeah, and again, these are mail votes, which are even bluer than the counties overall, which are about, they are quite blue on the whole. So to me, it looks like it's tracking to a recount, frankly, in Georgia, where it's going to be very close. Biden's going to make up further ground. You may have a recount. You probably will have, by the way, 2 runoffs in Georgia to determine control of the U.S. Senate if Biden becomes president. So all the data is looking good for Biden because they're mail votes, and they come in a lot more heavily Democratic, except in Arizona, it's more ambiguous. But in Georgia and Pennsylvania, the trends have been pretty consistently toward Biden.
That's what I was going to ask you. Arizona and Nevada likely to tighten for the president over the next day or two.
I would put those in 2 buckets. Arizona, the batches have had it tightening. I think in Nevada, there are a lot of Clark County, which is Las Vegas, mail ballots have not been counted yet. Those will probably ultimately help Joe Biden pad his lead. The rural parts of Nevada are very Republican, so I don't know in which order those come through, right? But you might see some shift toward Trump. I think when Clark County comes in, it would probably shift back toward Biden. Arizona's a lot more confusing. It's because these are GOP voters voted late. And so you actually have seen pretty good returns for Trump in late reported mail ballots in Maricopa County. Might not be enough to close the gap, but that's kind of their most optimistic case in some ways right now is Arizona.
So we're following the final counts in these 5 key states. David Muir, it feels like we're heading into an end game.
It feels that way, and we've been here for 3 days now together, George. It feels like a week, but only 3 days, guys, if you're keeping count. One thing I think bigger picture here is I remember that first night we were looking up at the big screen here of the blue wall states that looked very, very red in that early vote count, and we've been reminding our viewers, and this is, there's so much anxiety in the country right now for President Trump supporters and for Joe Biden supporters, quite frankly, and that was the same day election vote. We always knew that the Republicans would likely have a very strong showing on Election Day, and what we've been seeing in 24 hours, 48 hours since the election now are the early vote, the mail-in vote, the absentee ballot vote, and it was always believed that Democrats would perform more strongly that way. Now we're seeing that in Pennsylvania and in Georgia. And when you dive into Georgia, we looked at these numbers last night, Wisconsin, Michigan, and some of the through lines that really helped Joe Biden bring back that blue wall for Democrats. Some of the same through lines actually in the South as well. Let's take a look at Georgia, if we could, among independent voters. Donald Donald Trump won independence in Georgia by 5 points 4 years ago. Look at this. He's now winning 51%, according to the exit polls, to Donald Trump's 44%. Also, the other, and this is key because this is driving, it's the backdrop of this election. We're doing this in the middle of the pandemic. It's why we're still here on day 3, because so many people, that historic early vote, containing COVID-19, if that's what you believed was the most important issue over rebuilding the economy, look at that, more than half, 50% actually in Georgia, 50% in Georgia believing containing COVID. A couple of other little areas that I thought we should point out. Joe Biden doing much better with men than Hillary Clinton, up 5 points from 4 years ago, making gains with seniors, up, in fact, 12 points better than Hillary Clinton at this point, improving among college grads, 14 points better than 4 years ago. And again, as I mentioned, the central theme in Georgia is containing this pandemic in order to get the economy back up and running.
David Muir, thanks. The other central thing we're seeing being revealed by these election results, Lindsay, is the deep divisions of America that persist right now. Beneath that, changes within states.
Yeah, I continue to be struck by the potential realignment of American politics. Are there enough votes in Atlanta and its suburbs to flip Georgia, a state that hasn't voted for a Democrat for president since Bill Clinton in 1992? Arizona, birthplace of Barry Goldwater conservatism, home of John McCain. Will that flip? Pennsylvania, we're talking about a state that Joe Biden spent more time on the ground than any other battleground state. Will he be able to fortify that blue wall you're talking about, David, as a result of, and courtesy of votes in Philadelphia, where he headquartered his campaign? And if we can take a step back for a minute, I'm mindful at the same time of the primary in South Carolina and how the black vote there was credited with saving Joe Biden's campaign.
He was on life support.
And he famously said to Jim Clyburn, "You brought me back." And is it possible that the black vote in Philadelphia and Atlanta and the brown vote in Phoenix propel Joe Biden to the presidency?
That's one of the things we will be watching today. I think Steve Lisansamy is with us now. Again, you have some news out of Georgia?
Yes, George. We are now learning that a judge has tossed out a lawsuit that the Trump administration joined with state Republicans about an incident in Chatham County, Georgia, which is in the Savannah area. A Republican poll watcher from out of state had alleged that she saw one of the poll workers put a pile of ballots, absentee ballots that came in after the deadline, put them in the pile of ballots that were legal. And that poll worker essentially prompted this lawsuit. A judge has thrown out the lawsuit, and that's really so far the only case that the Trump administration has brought to the state of Georgia. One thing I'm going to point out is that the vote total, which on election night, midnight of after election night, which had a 300 and some thousand spread between Joe Biden and President Trump. President Trump was winning at that point. That number is now down to under 15,000 votes. It is going to be incredibly close here. And Fulton
Steve,
County, which has the largest number of these votes.
Sorry, are we expecting those new numbers to come in the next several hours?
We are. Fulton County is wrapping up as we speak, and Gwinnett County is now counting some of the different absentee ballots that they had issues, but we are expecting in the next few hours the Secretary of State to give us a better sense of where these numbers are, because right now they're all over the place in terms of how many ballots are outstanding and how many are being counted.
Okay, Steve, stand by. We're going to come back to you for more on that in a bit. But Dan Abrams, I saw you smile as this lawsuit was being described.
Well, because when you read the lawsuit, some out-of-state poll worker thinks that they may have seen someone putting ballots in a place that might have been the wrong place, and that's the subject of the lawsuit. I mean, that does not make a lawsuit. So it is hardly surprising that this particular lawsuit has been dismissed and thrown out. The more important issue is what Nate Silver mentioned before, which is if Georgia does become relevant, it is a state where anyone who is within 0.5% of the final result can request a recount. Now, as we talked about before, recounts typically shift a few hundred, maybe, the votes in a state like Georgia. Probably not going to make or break, but if it's close enough, it certainly could.
Yvette Simpson, the other reason this closing vote count in Georgia matters is it could create a second Senate runoff in the state of Georgia.
And we are bracing for that because, as you know, we may need that in order to get rid of Mitch McConnell and the speaker leadership in the leadership seat. So we're watching
Democracy for America there.
Yes, I got my Democracy for America hat on. We are watching closely.
It was the royal week.
We have already launched into a runoff territory in Georgia for Raphael Warnock. We are happy to add a second runoff seat and race in Georgia for Ossoff if he can pull this off. And it looks like that might actually happen.
Chair Moran, I want to stick on the lawsuits for a moment. The Trump campaign has had something of a victory in Pennsylvania.
It has, but we are hearing that may have been put on hold by the state Supreme Court just now. But the basic issue was that the Trump campaign wanted their observers to get closer to the count. And in Pennsylvania, because of the coronavirus, they had distanced some of the observers. The Trump campaign said they couldn't see whether some of these ballots had secrecy envelopes and the necessary things that needed to be there to have the count proceed. A lower court judge said, sure, fine, wear a mask. You can get a little closer, and I need to check this because it's just crossing the wire.
Okay, why don't you check that? Because we're going to go to Nevada right now. Let's put up the board and where things stand in Nevada right now, because I want to go to Matt Gutman, who's out in the state. You see that right now about, actually now, it looks like about 12,000 votes. Joe Biden's lead has expanded just a little bit. Matt Gutman, give us the latest numbers you're getting there on the ground.
Those are the numbers, George. He's expanded his lead to about 12,000. It was about 7,500 earlier this morning, and you saw that the needle moved just a little bit in terms of additional voters. We don't know exactly where these votes are coming from. The Secretary of State tells us there are tens of thousands of mail-in ballots that arrived on Election Day, November 3rd, and since then, in addition to that, there's some other voters who registered and voted on Election Day. Those are still being counted. The Biden campaign is very hopeful about those because most of those are in Washoe County and in Clark County, which is Las Vegas, which are the only Democratic strongholds in the county.
Let's break that down a little bit. Basically, you divide Nevada into three parts. You've got Washoe, which is Reno, Clark County, which is Las Vegas, heavily Democratic, and then basically the rest of the state.
That's exactly right. I mean, it is out of 16 counties, 2 are blue, and those are by far the most populous ones. And that's why just about half an hour ago, we saw here at the Clark County Election Center an almost surreal press conference by Trump operatives who came here to say that they were filing a lawsuit. And I have to read you some of the allegations because they said they believe that dead people were voting. They've seen irregularities. People that are not real citizens of the state are voting. They're confident there are thousands of people whose votes have been counted, who've moved out. We demanded answers. We demanded any sort of evidence. Time and again, they wouldn't take a single question from the press. They just got into a bus and drove away. You know, I don't know if that's desperation or what, but that is the only thing that we've heard from the Trump camp here in Nevada over the past 24 hours. And there was very little meat to it. They seem to be throwing everything in the kitchen sink at this election committee. And judges up and down the state have so far said the electoral system here in Nevada is working. There is no evidence of irregularities at this point, George.
Yeah, they had well over the 90% of the vote in by Election Day. Nate Silver, what are you seeing in these new numbers coming in Nevada?
So they're mail ballots from Clark County, which is Las Vegas. They went in about 2-1 for Joe Biden. Not a huge surprise, but it makes Trump's road pretty tough. Clark County is the majority of the population in Nevada. I'm not sure if there's enough vote out there in the rural areas to make up for these votes that Joe Biden is now adding.
Okay, thank you, Nate. John Carl, let me bring you in on this because you now had these reports. We've heard Cecilia talk about the Trump press conference today. We just had that report from Matt Gutman on the ground there in Nevada, the kind of press conferences that are being held on the ground there. Rudy Giuliani gave one in Pennsylvania yesterday. As the president stays mostly silent except for Twitter, he's got his legal and political operatives out there.
He has his legal and political operatives out there. I've spent a lot of time today, George, as you can imagine, talking to people close to the president and also to Republicans in Congress about the days ahead and where they see this going. And my sense is that they do believe that there is this path, and there is, obviously, because the race has not been called, but they believe there are enough votes outstanding in Arizona to flip that state for Donald Trump, and they believe that they can hold on in Georgia and in Pennsylvania. You know, Nevada, frankly, is a little bit less part of their strategy, but if they do all that, Donald Trump can be elected president. But, George, I have to tell you that virtually to a person, the Republicans I've spoken to about this say that this is a highly a majorly uphill battle. I'll put it this way: that it is a tough road ahead for this. But they're going to give the president and his legal team the time to pursue these efforts.
Well,
Frankly,
that's what I wanted to press you on, though. The question is how much time and how many states does he have to win to make that a viable legal recount strategy. If it's narrowed down to one state that is in dispute, perhaps that's possible. But if Joe Biden holds on to his leads in Nevada and Arizona and wins either Georgia or Pennsylvania, do they still see the Trump campaign pursuing this legal strategy for days and weeks?
They see, it really comes down to Arizona, to flipping Arizona, holding on to Pennsylvania, and holding on to Georgia. If those things do not happen, I don't think there's going to be a rush of Republicans telling the president he has to give up and come out and concede. They will give him some time. But it's not an indefinite amount of time. Remember, George, the Republicans had a very good night on Tuesday, outside of what may happen with the race at the top of the ticket. Republicans, it looks like, may well keep control of the Senate. Republicans, it looks like, may have actually picked up additional seats in the House, neither of which were expected. They did better than expected, you know, you're not going to see, and I think the silence of Republican leadership right now, in terms of rushing out to join the president in raising questions about, fundamental questions about the integrity of this election, that silence speaks very loudly. This is the president's hardcore supporters. You saw Rick Grinnell, his former director of national intelligence, out there in Nevada. You saw his son Eric and Rudy Giuliani in Pennsylvania. You aren't seeing people like Mitch McConnell and Republican leaders in the Senate and the House coming out and repeating the president's allegations that this election is being stolen. You just are not seeing that. That said, they're not going to push the president. They're going to give him time. And they also are not completely ruling out the possibility that he'll pull this off. But they are not joining him in making the allegations that he is making.
Right. All the votes have not been counted yet. But Sarah Fagan, John Carl makes an important point. We have not seen the Republican leadership out there echoing the calls of the president's legal team.
Yeah, and I don't think we're going to. I mean, there would have to be evidence of widespread fraud for that to happen, and we haven't seen that. Now, I will say, as someone who's run campaigns in large states, I ran Michigan in 2000. I remember sitting in my office and getting those calls from precinct workers about not being allowed to observe ballots. In large cities, unions run Democratic polling operations, and they do an amazing job at it. But it's one thing to be concerned, and it's another thing to allege fraud. I think the Trump campaign is right to be concerned and to ask questions, but alleging fraud is a whole other situation.
What do you think is the critical mass that will drive Republican leaders to say, Mr. President, it's time to close this down?
If we come out of this process and the president is behind in all of those 5 states on the board, there's not going to be a path. Now, if we flip Arizona, if that happens, if Pennsylvania is deeply in question and there is a legal path in Pennsylvania, you know, we take a step back here on the legal aspect of Pennsylvania, and you got to remember it's a partisan Supreme Court there. And there was a deal in the legislature that fell apart, and then the Democrats went to the Supreme Court, and they then extended the absentee deadline. The Supreme Court chose not to get involved, but they left a path to get involved. That may be a PR disaster, but there may be a good legal case for them.
Rahm Emanuel, you've been part of 2 presidential transitions. What's the best way for the Biden campaign to handle this period of limbo?
Well, I actually think they did a smart move about calling for calm. The reason is, let's assume what Pennsylvania happens. What they're actually looking forward is the next stage. They want all the votes to count, because if you actually do pick up Nevada, Arizona, and Georgia, your power as a president just went up 20 degrees. So rather than to cut it off, and they said all votes count, but they also know your leverage when dealing with a Republican Senate just increased. Second, I do think Donald Trump is going to rue the day that he said the vote by mail cannot be counted, etc. When you start looking at how the mail came in, he forced people to vote early in both Pennsylvania, Georgia, and across the country. he's going to rue that he did that. And third, to this point, I actually think there's going to be, in about 24 hours, a divergent in interest between Donald Trump and the remaining Republican leadership. And
so
that's
does
going
Joe
to become
Biden come out before that or after that?
I think, you know, again, I mean, my North Stars are assert without being presumptuous. If all of a sudden the numbers go up and we go from 253 to 270, you're going to see a little more presumptuous rather than a little more balance on the assert. But I think they're totally, from day one, they have been exactly underscoring in every move the message of not only calm, but unity. No, you know, no spiking the ball on the 20-yard line. Bring the country together, work together. Don't try to rub people's face and everything. But I do think that in this context, he's looking to the next chapter and he wants all the votes. If he can pick up a couple states like in Arizona and Georgia. And again, as I said last night, only now 4 people will have defeated an incumbent president in 100 years. This is a big deal. FDR, Ronald Reagan, Bill Clinton, and you're going to add Joe Biden's name to that.
Matt Dowd, your views on where we stand right now?
Well, it's like I said yesterday, George, you'd much prefer to be in Joe Biden's position today by far than in Donald Trump's position. And I think we're going to know every hour we go on, we're going to know. I think the Clark County numbers that just came in are a good sign for Joe Biden's campaign. I also think, George, this is one of those situations we talk, and I was involved in 2000 in the crazy 35 days in Florida. The biggest benefit George Bush had in 2000 was he was ahead. And if you're ahead, there's obviously all kinds of legal questions and legal things, but the power of being ahead when an unofficial count is finished is immense. And that's the problem that's going to be faced Donald Trump and the Trump world in this, is it looks like Joe Biden, as of right now, he's ahead in enough states to win the Electoral College. And it may be even more in the next few hours that we see as Pennsylvania comes in. So I think Joe Biden, even without the counts being finished, he's in a position now, George, in a very powerful position because he's ahead in the counts in enough states right now.
Matt Dowd, thanks. Heidi Heitkamp, you're from from the Dakotas. How does Joe Biden in this period now speak to the voters in your state who clearly did not vote for him?
I think the first thing he has to do is show up. His administration has to show up. They have to start talking about issues that matter here. I think nationally, he should work very closely with the governors because I think the governors tend to be less partisan and they can build support in the Congress for his agenda, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's a meaningful public health plan to combat coronavirus. If I could just comment briefly about Mitch McConnell, I think this is, for Mitch McConnell, it's heaven because he's not going to have to defend Donald Trump anymore and he can work with Biden. He got his 4-3 court. And so, you know, people who are expecting Mitch to rush into this and put the weight of the Senate behind any kind of election nonsense should understand that it's been a tough 4 years defending a lot of the stuff this president has done.
That was a marriage of convenience.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it worked for Mitch because he got what he most wanted, which was a 6-3 court. But going forward, when you're looking at an economic challenge, when you're looking at wanting to get back to debt and deficit as your major theme, this is a president who proudly announced when he got elected, I'm the king of debt. I don't care. He's embraced radical policies like debt can go up. That's not who Mitch McConnell is, and that's not who the majority in the Senate is with a Republican majority.
Heidi Heitkamp, thanks very much. Of course, there's still many votes to be counted. We do not have a decision yet. Let's go to the state of Pennsylvania, where they've been counting through the morning. I know, Eva Pilgrim, you're there for us right now. Donald Trump's still holding on to his lead. We were expecting to have a press conference from the governor around this hour, but that's been postponed. Give us the latest on where things stand.
Well, George, they're making some serious progress with the ballot counting here right now. At this point, they're at about 92% of the ballots that have been counted. Trump's lead is narrowing pretty significantly here. He's up about 115,000 votes. There are some 560,000 votes still to be counted, and most of those are mail-in ballots. Now, Joe Biden would need about 60% of those mail-in ballots in order to win the state of Pennsylvania, and I have to tell you, he's been trending well above that mark so far here. I just want to point out something that I heard from some of the people here in the city that I've talked to. They know the city of Philadelphia is under scrutiny with these mail-in vote counts because people are watching to see how this goes. That was in large part of their decision-making for putting that camera in the counting room to make sure that there was transparency so people could see how this vote was counted and what was being done in that room. They did not want there to be any questions. That is a camera that people all across this state and all across this country are able to watch, George.
Okay, Eva Pilgrim, thanks. So, Terry, now that's relevant to what you were looking at before this court case in Pennsylvania. What'd you find?
Well, the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania has been asked by Democrats to overturn this lower court ruling. They haven't yet. That lower court ruling said, sure, the Trump campaign observers, all observers can get a little closer, wear masks, and watch what's going on. But the key here, as in other states, is there not just evidence of widespread corruption, but evidence of any corruption. That case in Georgia that Steve Osunsami told us about, the judge dismissed that because there was no evidence that this outside observer had said. And a lawsuit without evidence is a tweet, basically. And that is essentially what you're seeing. And the courts will dispatch of those very quickly. There are some serious challenges, but right now, they're throwing everything against the wall, hoping something will stick.
We heard earlier from the Pennsylvania Attorney General, Josh Shapiro, about the process. Let's listen.
Yeah, look, I mean, there's a difference between what's being said and the reality. Here's the reality of what's happening in Pennsylvania. We've said for months we were going to secure and protect the election, and we had a very smooth process. And then we said we were going to make sure all these legal votes would be counted. And that's what's happening right now. It's happening in Philadelphia, and it's happening all across Pennsylvania. I gather there was some interest in having additional observers in the process. This has been a transparent process. It's been an open process. That's fine. But what is going to continue is the counting of these ballots to make sure that the will of the people here in Pennsylvania is respected and reflected in the ultimate outcome. And the way we do that is by following the law and counting these votes.
Pennsylvania Attorney General Tom, why don't you go back to the board and let's take a deeper dive into Pennsylvania, where the votes are outstanding, what we can expect in the coming hours.
Right, because the casual election observer may look at this right here and say Donald Trump's lead is 116,000 votes, right? That seems like a big margin. The problem is we know there are still a lot of outstanding votes, and I'm going to check real quick because the numbers are changing as we're coming on the air. I think it's 560 was the last number we have. That's how many ballots they're still counting. And here's the problem for President Trump. Those ballots are from this area, Philadelphia, and the suburbs around it, in Pittsburgh. These are the Democratic strongholds, George, in Pennsylvania. And if Joe Biden can run up the score there, he's going to catch up. That's why the Biden campaign feels they're in a good place. I want to show you one more data point, though, as we come out here, because we're talking about mail-in votes. We're talking about the early votes. This is the ratio right now. Look at this number, 80 to 20, and this is just 39% of the early vote, but the trend is way in Joe Biden's favor.
It is in Joe Biden's favor. Rick Klein, let me bring you in on that. This is something we were warning about before. David mentioned it at the top of the broadcast as well, but I think it was hard for everyone to wrap their minds around the magnitude of these numbers, the difference between the day vote and the mail-in vote.
Yeah, this is exactly the situation that election officials and a lot of outside observers said was very likely, that you would have a large number of votes that were banked by the Biden campaign before Election Day itself. And really, there's two main reasons that you're seeing an overwhelming Biden number out of the numbers that we're seeing come in now. One is they're mainly out of Democratic areas. They're coming out of urban areas, which traditionally report a little bit later. And then separately, this push toward mail-in voting. It was a major Democratic point. They were urging people to get mail-in votes. And paradoxically, it makes it harder to count. It takes longer, even though you're voting earlier. So this is exactly the situation that we expected. But you're right. Looking at the maps, looking at the math, it's kind of hard to conceptualize.
And just to underscore that, one of the reasons the Biden campaign is confident in Pennsylvania, we've seen their lead widen dramatically in Michigan.
That's exactly right. The same dynamics that you saw play out in Wisconsin, which initially looked pretty good for President Trump. Now it's a 20,000 vote victory, it would appear, for Joe Biden, and even more dramatically in Michigan. That's what they're expecting. They still see a lot of vote, hundreds of thousands of mail-in votes out of Philadelphia and Pittsburgh and the immediate suburbs that they think are Biden. Biden votes, that they think these numbers are going to break dramatically in their direction.
Okay, David Muir, what else are you seeing in Pennsylvania?
A couple of things. First, independence, which we've been talking about a lot since last night. Let's take a look at Pennsylvania. Joe Biden, this is a 10-point improvement among independents, 51 to 43. Significant lead there for Joe Biden with independents. He also improved upon Hillary Clinton's support in Philadelphia in the suburbs. Biden's trailing Trump in northeast Pennsylvania, but he did improve on where Hillary Clinton was. He's chipped away at men. He took support from Trump among college-educated white men. He's improving among moderates, up 4 points from 2016. And I know the frustration for particularly President Trump's supporters right now in Pennsylvania with this anxiety being caused by this tightening of the race. We also have to remember that just as we were warning for weeks on the news that facing this pandemic, we would have this historic early vote likely and that it would take time to count, that lawmakers in Pennsylvania said you can't get an early start on counting that vote. They tried. There was a push for that. That's why everyone just has to continue to be patient as these votes.
Yeah, it was part of the Republican effort to suppress mail-in voting. They did not want to encourage mail-in voting at all. Martha Raddatz, you spent an awful lot of time in those suburbs of Philadelphia where we're still waiting for some vote right now.
I certainly did, George, and there was a lot of change that I saw from 2016 because I spent a lot of time there as well in Pennsylvania. And this time, I'm thinking this morning of a young couple. Both voted for Trump. Two young kids, they voted for Trump in 2016, and this time neither one of them did. And I have to say, I think the wife, the woman, turned earlier than her husband, but he eventually did and had never, ever voted for a Democrat before. Both of them said again, and we say this over and over and over again, but it was character and chaos. They just do not like the way Trump operates. George, I also wanted to add a little something about Pennsylvania and the overseas vote. In 2016, there were 22,000 mail-in absentee votes from overseas, U.S. citizens overseas, including 7,788 military. Right now, those overseas ballots can be received in Pennsylvania up to November 10th. Also, sort of a similar story there in Georgia, but those overseas ballots have to be received by November 6th. And when you think about the military, I think we all think it's a bit more conservative, and certainly the votes in the past have been, but it is very diverse. It is a big reflection of where the country is as well.
It certainly is. Rahm Emanuel, you've made this point before. One of the things we know we've seen in this election, the base is energized on either side, but it does appear the longer we go on and we look into these states, Joe Biden did something that successful presidential candidates have to do, flip those independents.
Yes, I mean, to win the White House, if you go over 100 years, you got to win the independent vote. And the Democratic Party nominated somebody who was most appealing in persuading independents to reject the chaos and conflict of Donald Trump for the calm and compassion of Joe Biden. And that has been, if it bears out, which I think it will, that has been the right electoral strategy, and I actually believe it will also be the right governing strategy.
One of the most unusual aspects of this election was that, of course, it was conducted during the pandemic. It's led to this expansion of mail-in voting across the country. So I want to bring in Mary Alice Parks for a little bit more on this. We have several states that had a lot of experience with mail-in voting, like Colorado, like the states in the Pacific Northwest, but places like Pennsylvania had not had widespread mail-in voting before, and we saw that in the primaries they were kind of getting their sea legs on how to make the mail-in voting work.
Absolutely. In Pennsylvania, they passed a law just a year ago that would allow voters to vote absentee without needing an excuse. That just dramatically changed how people in Pennsylvania were able to cast their ballots. And then Democrats went to the state legislature and said, okay, now make it easier for us to count all those ballots. And they had a lot of inter-party infighting about how to get that done. I mean, you had Republicans in the House that just didn't want to let the state start counting those ballots earlier. And so now this is what we're left with. A state that had an explosion of mail-in balloting, but didn't change the rules to make it easier to count those ballots ahead of time.
One of the things, thank you, Mary Alice, though, we have seen, Lindsay Davis, is all of us are going to know more secretaries of state than I ever thought we knew before. And on the whole, Democrat and Republican, what an impressive group.
Right, I would agree with you. And what's interesting is in the last few days of the run-up to the election, we interviewed a them across multiple states. And I started asking the same question of all of them. Is there anything that keeps you up at night with regard to this election? Every single one said misinformation and disinformation. And they really seem to anticipate this kind of scenario, because all of them also said that it wouldn't end on Election Day, that this was something that they continued, might be perpetuated potentially by the president in subsequent days.
I want to take that to Pierre Thomas. Pierre Thomas, our Chief Justice Correspondent. Pierre, one of the things, one of the other dogs that didn't bark, I'm wondering at least, in this election, there was so much concern about the spread of misinformation and disinformation. Of course, there was a fair amount of that out there. There's so much concern about foreign interference, and it appears clearly that no election system was breached by any foreign entities. Tell us more about what was being done to prepare for that and what you've seen in the days since the election.
Well, the FBI, Homeland Security, and the social media companies were much more attentive to any efforts to do that. There were some opportunities, and we saw some foreign nations, Russia and Iran, attempt to probe for voter registration information. That apparently got nowhere in terms of affecting what we saw unfold. We also saw companies like Facebook say that they employed 35,000 people to look for any disinformation campaigns and dismantle them before they took place. They noted a couple efforts from Russia earlier in the year. They attacked those immediately. The concern today, George, is as we wait and people are urged to be calm, that people who are protesting, as these ballots are counted, there is some concern. Where does free speech end and where does intimidation begin? Governor of Pennsylvania today put out a statement saying, quote, that planned attacks on our elections this morning are undemocratic and all elected officials must denounce them. So he seems to be talking about people who may be showing up outside where the votes are being counted, some of them wearing weapons. Again, where does free speech end and where does intimidation begin?
And Pierre, talk a little bit more about what role the Justice Department is going to play in this. They're saying that that federal prosecutors do have a role if they see potential violations of federal law in polling places.
Right, that's sort of expected. What they're saying is that, look, if there was some kind of actual attack as people are counting these ballots, they want to be in a position to aid and assist local and state officials who might have to deal with that. So they're not saying that they've seen that level of concern at this point, but they want to be prepared so that their people know you can go in and help.
Pierre Thomas, thanks very much. Let's get some more results. More is coming in from the state of Nevada right now. Matt Gutman, what are we learning?
Betty doesn't have quite a 1% lead. I hear you, George.
Okay, go for it.
George, I hear you. I was just saying that Joe Biden has widened his lead by just a tad. He's now about 11,000 and change votes ahead. That's still less than 1%. That's because a lot of the rural counties are now starting to trickle in those mail-in ballots. What everybody is waiting for here is Clark County. The Biden campaign, I literally just got off the phone with them, tells me that's where they're hoping to make some serious headway against the president. One reminder, a recount is possible even 3 days after canvassing ends on November 16th. So President Trump has more than 2 weeks to try to challenge this vote if he, in fact, loses Nevada.
And Matt, give us a sense of the timing of when you expect the rest of the vote to come in.
It's been any minute now for over an hour, right? So we expected it, we're about 45 minutes. We expected it at 9 a.m. And it's been a trickle from rural counties, a little bit from Washoe, which is Reno, a very Democratic stronghold. But again, Clark County is the big dump that we're waiting for. We could get more in about 20 minutes. There's a press conference right here at the Clark County Election Center. We'll obviously keep you apprised of any new developments in terms of the vote count.
I want you to go back and watch that, but you're saying they expect to get to 100% vote count today?
Again, this is the unofficial vote count, but they expect to make some significant headway, right? They won't get to 100% because they still have to verify and clear all the signatures. That is something that will take some time. They have until November 10th to get through that element. But other than that, I would say probably well over 95, 97% of the vote should be in unofficially at some point this morning, at least in Pacific time. So we're expecting a lot more. Again, everything depends on Clark County at this point. 70% plus of the entire populace of the state of Nevada is right here. And when those mail-in ballots come in, that'll give us a pretty clear indication of where this stands. And even if there are some missing ballots across the state, there is no way that is really going to tip the balance one way or another. Again, the Biden campaign is very confident that they will have probably a 2-to-1 margin in terms of Clark County here in their favor. So when that number drops in Clark County, that's when they will officially heave a sigh of relief and not officially declare victory, but certainly feel extremely confident that they've taken Nevada.
Yeah, they've had that consistently in Nevada. Let's go to next door to Arizona. Whit Johnson is there. Would give us a sense of where the count is right now. I know we're expecting another big cache of votes to come in this evening. When do they expect to finish in Arizona? Where do things stand right now?
George, I actually just got off the phone with Maricopa County elections officials a short time ago, and they tell us don't hold your breath. They're going to do that one big release of results later this evening. They're only going to do one, not two like they did the night before. But they said that the vote counting, the ballot counting here will likely take days and probably into the weekend. And if you do some of the math that we have here, it all makes sense. We still have about 275,000 outstanding absentee ballots in Maricopa County. There are about 17,000 provisional ballots and several thousand more that need further research. And then on top of that, you have about 100,000 outstanding ballots from other counties. And if you ask the Democrats and Republicans, both will say that they have a pathway depending on which county you're looking at. So this could still take some time. Yesterday, we know they were able to tabulate more than 130,000 ballots. So that gives you a sense that, you know, maybe we're at least 2-3 days out. They say, look, this is historic turnout like they've never seen before. They are counting ballots faster than they ever have before, but they need to verify signatures, and the process is going to take time. In the meantime, I just want to emphasize that tension is running high here. Overnight, we did see some protests. Pro-Trump supporters demonstrating outside the county recorder's office. Some of them were armed and actually tried to get inside to monitor some of the vote counting. Another one of their complaints and concerns, and there's actually a lawsuit that's been filed over this, and there will be a hearing later today, is this issue over using a Sharpie pen to mark some of the ballots. There was some concern from conservatives that maybe those ballots would be thrown out and that people were actually given them. Now, the county here, the state, is trying to reassure people that even if you use a Sharpie ballot, that will be counted. And so there is so much at stake here in Arizona. But again, Democrats are still confident that they can turn this state blue for the first time since 1996. George?
Whit, thank you. Dan Abrams, we have Sharpies in Arizona. We have smudged postmarks in Pennsylvania. How are judges going to look at this?
Well, look, this is typical for an election where you have issues that arise with particular votes. You have confusing ballots at times.
Those of us oldest remember hanging chads
totally,
from 2000.
Absolutely. So the key is that there is no systemic problem. I mean, the allegation actually started with the Sharpies. The allegation was that it was intentional, right? That certain people were given the Sharpies in an effort to make their votes not count. They're now coming out and saying, of course, that wasn't the case. But look, we have to think about some of the bigger picture allegations here. We keep hearing the word fraud, right? President mentions fraud, et cetera. There are two sorts of possible fraud. There's voters committing it, right, which would be on a sort of small scale. Someone gets a ballot with someone else's name, they send it in, an extra vote for whoever they're trying.
An infinitesimal percentage.
Correct. Correct. The issue when you're talking about voter fraud now is you're going to probably have to get to a point where you're going to be accusing election officials of literally stuffing the ballot boxes, okay? Because in Pennsylvania, if Joe Biden ends up with 100,000 or whatever it is over, the only argument that the president could make would be ballot stuffing. Let's be clear what that means. That means he's suggesting that there would be some level of a conspiracy among election officials there to risk their freedom and go to prison for a long period of time in an effort to try to sway the election. And if you are going to make any sort of allegation like that, you better have evidence. You better have facts. And so far, there are none.
Cecilia, I want to take that to Cecilia Vega. Cecilia Vega, I was on that phone call earlier today, and at least one Trump official was talking about exactly that, saying the Democrats were going to be susceptible to the same kind of things that Richard Daley did back in 1960 in Chicago. I know you have a new statement from the president.
Yeah, and it's in the same vein of exactly what we're talking about. You know, and I got to say, George, before I read you the statement, this statement is unlike any, I think, we're talking about it here on the team that we've ever seen before. First of all, it's a statement from the president himself, issued by the campaign. Normally, it would be the White House that would send out a statement like this.
So a statement, not a tweet.
It's a statement, not a tweet, and this is what I was going to say. It's also in all caps, which reads like it would normally be a presidential tweet. And Twitter has been, as we know, slapping these warning labels about misleading tweets that the president has been issuing. So I'm wondering, speculating here, but we're wondering if this is a way to sort of circumvent what would have likely been marked as a misleading statement coming from the president had he tweeted it out. So let me read it to you. That
yeah, we're not going to put it up, but you can read it.
Yeah, I'll read it to you. Quote, "If you count the legal votes, I easily win the election. If you count the illegal and late votes, they can steal the election from us!" Exclamation point, end quote. So obviously, that's not true. These are not illegal votes that are being counted. We've said this repeatedly ad nauseum. I'm not going to get into all of that again. But what you mentioned that phone call that we were on with the campaign today, and the campaign was pushed on this. Why is there this difference? The president says stop the votes, yet you are in places, the campaign, like Wisconsin, asking for a recount, Arizona asking to keep counting. What is this difference? How can you justify it? And the campaign is trying to explain this away. They're misrepresenting what the president is saying by saying he's only talking about illegal votes. That's not what the president, or votes cast after Election Day. That's not what the president is talking about, nor has he been in any of these tweets that he's been making. And they were pushed because places like Pennsylvania, as we talked about yesterday, still have ballots from military members and overseas residents that have yet to even hit the deadline to be returned. So if we take the president at his word here, he's essentially saying even those ballots from service members should not be counted at this point. There has been a long history of this president claiming fraud without offering any evidence, not just on this, on a number of topics. He claimed that the 2016 election would be rigged. He's been claiming that this one would be rigged as well. And the further we get into the week, George, we are getting deeper and deeper, and I say this factually, we are getting deeper and deeper into conspiracyville land from the president and the campaign, talking about magical bags of ballots being discovered. There's no evidence of that. We've just not seen that. I say that as a black and white issue that does not exist at this point.
Right now, the president is losing the popular vote. He's behind in the electoral vote. There's no question about that. The statement, if you count the legal votes, I easily win the election, is not just without evidence. It is false. Certainly at this point, it is false. Mary Bruce, we have a response from the Biden campaign, from former Vice President Biden himself.
Well, the former vice president has been on Twitter himself this morning, and he says, "Be patient, folks," in a very Biden way. "Votes are being counted, and we feel good about where we are." But I have to tell you, they are concerned about the president's, Hail Mary strategy here, not because they think it's going to be successful in any way. In fact, Biden's team is calling this a flailing strategy designed to prevent people's votes from being counted. They've said it's meritless, nothing more than an attempt to prevent the inevitable. So they are very confident. And Biden does have a massive legal team assembled. They are absolutely adamant that they feel that the president's attempts to try and stop the count or his other legal efforts that he may pursue are doomed to fail. But what they are concerned about is that all of this creates just a cloud of uncertainty, that it may create even more confusion within the public. And they feel that that's exactly Donald Trump's intention here, that he's trying to sow doubt, even if he's not successful. And you have to remember that Joe Biden and his team, if elected, he is facing this massive, monumental task of somehow trying to bring this country together to move forward. That can become exponentially more difficult if you are accepting the presidency in an environment where we are having even more confusion, we are seeing even more bitter partisanship, and Biden's team believes that that is only being fed and perpetuated by President Trump himself.
I want to take that to Pierre Thomas, and Pierre, picking up on what Mary just saying that the president's intention is to sow doubt. That's what the Biden team believes. That echoes precisely the intentions of the Russians in this election, has been for the last 4 years.
Absolutely. The concern is spreading disinformation of any kind. is not helpful. And I must tell you, George, if you think about what Whit just told us about what took place as the votes were being counted in Arizona, where people showed up, apparently some with weapons, while people were trying to count the vote. And law enforcement officials have said that statements like stealing the election, these kind of things, are very challenging for them in this kind of environment. So as people need to be patient, there's concern that if you stoke up animosity so much where people are hearing words like steal, you could have a very dangerous situation.
Thank you, Pierre. Martha Redditz, though, we know at least before the election that President Trump supporters had ears to hear this kind of message. It's going to be interesting to see what happens after an election.
Well, I've talked to several of them, and several Trump supporters are completely turned off by what the president is saying it is presumptuous of him to say this is fraud. He shouldn't be saying that. They don't like it. Others, however, in a very Trump town in Texas, talking to some voters there, and they are saying that conspiracy theories are spreading like wildfire, that people are tuning into everything the president says. We all know the president loves to change the subject. He is a master of changing the subject. The country's talking about COVID. Let's talk about something else. Let's do some other shiny object. There is nothing he can talk about now except the election. He cannot change the subject from what the country is riveted to right this moment, the election. So the only way he can really change that subject is talk about the election going wrong. But it is resonating in some places. Other places, it is absolutely not resonating. And George, if I can pick up very briefly on what Pierre was talking about and foreign interference, the head of the NSA said they have already taken offensive cyber operations to try to stop any foreign interference. The director saying, I'm confident the actions we've taken against adversaries over the past several weeks and months have ensured they're not going to interfere in our elections. Washington Post reported that that was Iran, and that makes sense. Russia, obviously, trying to interfere, but very rare for them to make a statement like this. We didn't know for months and months after 2016 that Russia had interfered.
Terry Moran, thank you, Martha. Terry Moran, we know that Russia was relatively successful in sowing doubt in our system over the last 4 years. Martha's probably right that after an election, people will be turned off by language like this. I want to ask the question in reverse, though. What if it works?
Well, what if it works? We are vulnerable to it, and we're vulnerable to it in this period. Not just because we've been softened up by years now of Russian disinformation and disinformation domestically, right? There's all kinds of Facebook pages and Twitter feeds that you can follow that'll steer you wrong. And right now, in this period, as they're counting votes, I think the president himself is preying on this vulnerability, which is if your candidate on election night has a lead, and then it goes away over the next couple of days, you feel like, hey, they're stealing it from me. And he's using that language. And it's actually, when we use it too, right, that he's pulling ahead or the slipping. That's a metaphor. What actually has happened already happened. There's a pile of votes, and they're counting them, right? Like scratching the numbers off of a lottery ticket. Nobody's changing the numbers unless you have evidence of widespread systematic wrongdoing. But what you have is that feeling, that natural feeling, I was ahead in the race and now I'm falling behind. So people are vulnerable to that. It's one of the reasons to stay calm. And we've been softened up as a country by foreign disinformation and our own predilection for the wildest, most dramatic, melodramatic conspiracy theories we can find.
Rahm Emanuel, the vice president's response was stay calm. Is that enough?
I think so. I think it's, for him, it's a responsible thing. For the country, it's a responsible thing to stay calm. And he's also, as I said earlier, I think he's trying to make sure that all the votes are counted, consistent with what he said. I do want to just take this moment and say to all the American people, they worked right. And to the FBI, Microsoft, Homeland Security, they actually protected our democracy. And when all the other things are breaking, we should actually take a moment and say, check the box.
Yeah, it did come through, and they did show great protection over the last several weeks. David Muir.
I would just say, I think it's interesting, this conversation we're having about a statement from Donald Trump via his campaign in all caps, which is nothing new. We've all become so accustomed to this with his tweets and these claims which are not true about simply counting the votes that have already been cast. And then to have a response from Joe Biden, by the way, upper, lowercase, a normal sentence on Twitter, simply saying, be patient, keep the faith. A similar message he's been saying now for 3 days. And there's already been a response on social media about people saying, there's another encouraging sign, and this is certainly from Biden supporters who are saying this, that maybe Biden's not going to be a Twitter guy, that he's just offering simple, careful messaging, again, in simple sentences. He's not going around Twitter, as Cecilia suggested. And I think that's an interesting point, and perhaps that's true, that this is now strategy to get past that flagging on Twitter, to simply put out these statements, which is why, of course, George, you pointed out we're not putting it up on the screen. Got to be very careful as we try to stay calm and steady here, because voters are anxious really on both sides. Supporters of the president, supporters of Joe Biden, and we just have to help remind everyone that we knew this was coming. We predicted there would be a long delay in counting these early votes. Mary Alice talked about the battle in Pennsylvania to try to get those votes counted earlier because they knew they would be up against this monumental task. Lawmakers blocked that, so here we are. Day 3, we're still counting, but again, as Terry points out, these are votes that have been cast legally in this country.
Heidi Heitkamp.
You know, I think what we have to see here is the value of local news sources. For the last 4.5 years, the president has told everybody, do not trust what you see on national television. That has not translated to local television or local news. So the real strategy here should be getting as much information into that local news network so that they feel comfortable. Otherwise, they're going to get their information on Facebook, on Twitter, and it's going to feed into the confirmation bias. So my advice would be get out there, get at a granular level, discuss what's actually happening on the ground in these states and why this makes sense. And if you don't do that, you're going to suffer the Facebook wrath of conspiracy theories.
You know, Heidi, it's interesting. That seemed to be what the vice president's campaign was doing during the course of this campaign. He was getting hit from the Trump campaign for sitting in his basement, but he actually was doing a fair amount of local interviews every single day by satellite.
Yeah, I spent the morning looking for people to go on my brother's talk radio show. He talks to 100,000 people every day. Ed Randell came on to talk about why this makes sense in Pennsylvania. You may not be reaching the hardcore Trump folks, but you're reaching the people who may be persuaded if there's a media void. And so we need to get this message out, not just on shows like this, which I'm proud to be on, but we need to get it out in a granular level at the local level in trusted sources.
Heidi Heitkamp, thanks very much. Just after 1 o'clock in the East right now, let's reset where we are now in this race for president. There's the board right there. Joe Biden has 253 electoral votes. He's won 22 states. Donald Trump, 214 electoral votes, 23 states. You see those states in the grade that are still in play right now: Nevada, Arizona, Georgia, North Carolina, and Pennsylvania. Let's go through them one by one and take a look at the vote. Coming in first from Nevada, Joe Biden now has about a 9,000 vote lead. Some new vote has come in the last hour, but it's a little bit of a wash. A slight increase for Joe Biden right there. In Arizona, we heard Whit Johnson say in the last hour that they're going to take their time counting. It could take several more days there, but Joe Biden, despite some tightening overnight, has held his lead in the state of Arizona. Let's go to the East. Georgia, we're expecting many more votes to come in this afternoon, and it's gotten closer over the course of the last several hours. 14,000 votes now separate Donald Trump and Joe Biden. That could be heading for a recount in the state of Georgia. North Carolina, not much change there. Donald Trump holding on to his lead. And, of course, Pennsylvania, the key state right now, where Donald Trump's still ahead, but his lead has been narrowing over the last several hours. Cecilia Vega, you have some news?
Yeah, George, we're just hearing more mood from inside the campaign in the wake of the, or I should say rather, mood inside the Trump team in the wake of that statement that we just got from the president's campaign. So this is coming from our John Santucci, Catherine Falder's team, that you know, we're hearing sources close to the president now sort of start to use a bit of a reality check in their words, that the path ahead is narrow, that it is increasingly looking tough for the president. And this is different than the public posturing that we have been hearing. Just yesterday, we heard the press secretary say that they would fight this all the way to the Supreme Court. That conference call that we were on with the campaign today, when they ticked off the list of states, when they said that they were extremely confident about places like Arizona and Pennsylvania. they've got a lot of hope in Arizona, and that's basically where their numbers are. But as they are seeing this race tighten, we're being told that there's increasingly growing concern about the state of play from inside the Trump
Let me bring
team.
that to John Carl. And John Carl, we know that Donald Trump is the most untraditional of presidents. It's hard to imagine him giving the kind of concession speech we've seen from other presidents and presidential candidates in the past, and how he would cast what's happening if indeed these votes do turn out to have gone against him as they're fully counted.
My sense, George, and my sense of talking to people close to the president, they believe that ultimately when this process is finished, he is not going to resist the outcome, but he may not acknowledge it. I wouldn't be looking for a concession in any traditional sense from Donald Trump, as in a concession of calling Joe Biden and saying, congratulations, you won a hard-fought campaign. I certainly wouldn't accept that. But you may see him essentially concede that the election was stolen from him. He's always going to say that. George, he lost the popular vote in 2016 by some 3 million votes, but he's never acknowledged that. He has said repeatedly that he believes that was simply because of a bunch of manufactured votes, illegitimate votes in California. So I wouldn't expect that kind of moment. I mean, you remember it well in 2000 when Al Gore, after the recount was stopped in Florida, you know, after 35 days of a grinding battle day in and day out during that recount, came out and very graciously congratulated George W. Bush on a victory. That is not in the character of this president. I thought it was interesting right as we went into the election, the day before Election Day, when the president said that losing is tough, especially for me. Winning is easy. I think this is going to be easy. But all that said, and I've talked to many people close to the president just in the last hours, they do not think that he is going to resist an outcome, even if it's not the outcome that he desperately wants. But not resisting and accepting and conceding in a traditional way, those are different things.
Yeah, they certainly are an important distinction. John Carl, thanks very much. I want to bring in Katie Hobbs now. She's the Secretary of State of Arizona. Secretary Hobbs, thanks for joining us again today. I think I was speaking with you a few hours ago this morning on Good Morning America. Thanks for coming back. What's the latest on where things stand in Arizona?
Well, in terms of numbers, it looks like we're about 450,000 ballots left to count statewide. The bulk of those, obviously, Maricopa County, just under 300,000 left in Maricopa County. And what we have been told by Maricopa County election officials is that they anticipate counting the bulk of those, all of those late early ballots that still are being signature verified by this weekend. So what I think that means is that we'll have a much more clear picture of where things stand here in Arizona tomorrow.
So that's tomorrow. What can we be expecting tonight? I know you're saying you're going to be releasing more results later this evening.
Yep, Maricopa County has told us that they're planning to upload their daily tabulation totals every day at 7 p.m., so 9 p.m. your time. And so that's when we'll see the next, big update to election results here.
Okay, and I know we were just talking about these demonstrations that you've seen at some polling sites in Arizona. How big of a concern is that?
Well, we're certainly concerned for everyone's safety. We're talking about election workers who have been working around the clock to make sure they're doing their job and counting every vote, which is, what these protesters are asking for. So I'm really not sure what they're trying to accomplish, because they're actually creating a disruption and distraction from these election workers doing their job of counting every vote, which is what they're demanding.
Has it affected the mood inside the rooms at all?
I think that these folks are just really focused on getting their job done. I know that everyone I talked to said that everybody was safe, and they had worked with the sheriff's office to ensure that there was nothing happened to any of the employees. So I think they're just really wanting to, they know that everybody's waiting on Arizona, and they're wanting to get this done.
And this is a nonpartisan process?
Yes, absolutely.
Secretary, thanks for joining us today. Tom Yamas, why don't you go up to the board on Arizona and give us a sense of where these votes are coming from?
Yeah, I want to give you a sense of what's happening in Maricopa County because this is the largest county. It includes Phoenix, it includes Mesa. Maricopa really is America writ small because you have the big city, you have the small city, you have ranches, you have farmers, you have diversity with Latino voters. But this is the big headline, George. Joe Biden's on top in Maricopa County. 4 years ago, President Trump was on top, and that's where we just heard from Secretary Hobbs that more than 250,000 votes are still outstanding. The other big part of Arizona is Pima County. There are also outstanding votes there, and Joe Biden is performing higher than Hillary Clinton was 4 years ago. So these are all good trend lines. And one more I want to show you, George. We talk about the early vote, and we look at Arizona, what the trend line is right now. Joe Biden's on top there. So you have three major data points that are showing Arizona is still in Joe Biden's favor. But I got to tell you, in the rural parts of the state, Donald Trump, we've been talking about, he's been able to build his base as well as Biden's been able to build his base. The rural vote is still coming out for Donald Trump in a big way. His numbers are very similar, especially in Pinal County, which is sandwiched in between Maricopa and Tucson. He's performing a little lower, but he is where he needs to be. So we're going to have to wait and see. 69,000 vote difference around there. Still more than 400,000 ballots. So there's still a lot of vote out there, George.
Okay, Tom, thanks. Let's go to Nate Silver. And then, Nate, we've heard several times now that the Trump strategy really does hinge on overtaking Joe Biden in Arizona from inside their camp. How realistic at this point?
It's plausible given a certain set of assumptions. What's weird about Arizona is that in most states you have mail votes that are very Democratic. In Arizona, the votes that arrived early in the mail were very Democratic also. The ones that arrived late and are being counted now were more GOP. Though Trump has to win the remaining votes by about 17 or 18 points, we're not sure if there are different categories of ballots. There are also ballots that were dropped off on Election Day, which may not be as Republican. So Trump can win Arizona if, like, every assumption that you make is right. It's a plausible story. Would I bet on it? Probably not. But, you know, it's a theory of the case, at least.
But if it came in exactly as it came in early this morning, late last night, is that enough to do it?
That would be recount territory. It's exactly, I mean, Trump needed to win by these votes by about 18 points. They were about Trump plus 17. So it would be really to a recount threshold.
Okay, Whit Johnson in Arizona, anything new out there?
Well, George, I just want to point to a couple things that both Nate and Tom pointed to there. Pima County. Democrats are focusing on Pima County right now because that traditionally leans to the left. Tucson, another big urban area there. They're hoping that some of the outstanding ballots from Pima County will help bolster Joe Biden in a way that Donald Trump can't catch up. At the same time, I think Democrats are a little surprised at how well Donald Trump is performing with some of these absentee ballots here in Maricopa County. I think that he's been overperforming what a lot of Democrats estimated he would. And again, the Trump campaign said they knew this would happen based on people who dropped off their ballots on Election Day. So it really is unknown which way this thing could go. I also want to bring up another scenario that we really haven't talked about much, and that is the Senate race here in Arizona. Democrat Mark Kelly, the astronaut, the husband of Gabby Giffords, who, as we know, was shot and nearly killed back in 2011, is now leading Martha McSally, the Republican, and he is actually outperforming Joe Biden. So it raises the possibility of a split ticket situation here in Arizona where you could have, if Donald Trump could catch up and win the state, the Republican there, and then a Democratic senator. And if you just take a step back here, back in 2011, people split the ticket multiple times. More than 150,000 people voted for the Republican governor and then voted for the Democratic senator, Kyrsten Sinema. We actually spoke to an independent voter who voted for Obama and then is voting for Donald Trump, and also Mark Kelly. So there's that independent spirit here that is difficult to predict. 1/3 of the voters in Arizona are independents, and I think that's why there is some anxiety on both sides, because people really don't know what's going to happen.
And it could take days to count. I want to go to Rebecca Jarvis right now, our chief business correspondent. Rebecca, now for the second day in a row in the wake of this election, we're seeing financial markets respond pretty positively to what's been happening in our political system.
Well, that's right, Georgia. And what we're seeing is that the Dow is up more than about 500 points right now. And when you think about what Wall Street does, it is often expectations versus reality. What Wall Street expects versus what actually materializes can really change the scope of things. And coming into this election, Wall Street was betting on the potential of a blue wave in Congress. They felt that if that was the case, it would undo some of the pro-business policies that have really helped this market in recent years. And there was a concern that if that was the case, the market might sell off. Well, that is not the look of things. There appears to be a divide in Congress. That split Congress, that gridlock tends to be a benefit to stock markets, and historically the markets perform better under a split Congress. The other expectation and fear coming into this election is that we might have a long, drawn-out race. There could be chaos. And as far as Wall Street is concerned, that hasn't materialized. And one of the biggest things is what the chatter is on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange right now as trading continues. I've talked to a number of floor traders, including veteran floor trader Jonathan Corpina, and he told me that on the floor right now, the belief is Biden has this. In fact, he says there is no chatter of a Trump victory at this point, and the belief is that this Congress, along with a Biden president, would be divided, that a lot of the things that Biden has talked about, things, for example, George, you pushed him on, those tax hikes, that they very likely will not materialize or won't be able to materialize, at least in the view that they might have been if there had been a full-on blue wave, that regulations will be stymied, that some of the pro-business things that have been in place for many years now will continue to stay in place because of this divide.
Okay, Rebecca, thanks very much. Yvette Simpson, I want to go quickly this, and then we're going to go to Clark County. What the market's like could be trouble for House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, who's facing diminished Democratic majorities in the House. She's now also facing a Republican likely control of the Senate, depending on what happens in Georgia, and unrest among a lot of progressives who are pushing Joe Biden for more expansive programs.
She is going to have heartburn. She is going to have quite trouble, but I think hopefully she can handle it. The reality is again, what we're seeing around the nation is this funny inconsistency. I talked about it yesterday. We're seeing in these initiatives, these ballot initiatives, where progressive ideas are winning, and we're seeing moderate. Florida's a good example. $15 an hour, won by 20 points. Montana, marijuana legalization won overwhelmingly, but we lost that Senate seat. We lost Florida for the presidential, essentially. And so what Nancy Pelosi has to balance is, where is the public? Are we ready to bring progressive ideas through the House? Can we get some negotiation to get some of those things passed? I think the first big question will, of course, be around coronavirus, because there's a lot of folks who are still waiting on relief. Will we get UBI? Will we have conversations about making sure we're getting money out to communities to make sure people can weather the storm? So I think what's going to happen is you're seeing a growing progressive support in the House. You're seeing Republican control of the Senate. And then where is Joe Biden going to play as well?
Exactly. I want to bring Ram and Sarah in on this as well. Two very different expectations for Joe Biden if indeed he does win. This is not going to be with a blue wave that brings in a Democratic increased majority and a Democratic Senate. He's going to have to work with Republicans to get anything done if indeed Republicans maintain control of the Senate.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, remember, after 2012, when President Obama ran on a specific campaign, it was Joe Biden who negotiated that deal with Mitch McConnell. So there's actually a very sensible way that he can actually, in my view, is exactly the right person to lay out the contours. They know each other from years in working in the Senate, and relationships count. I would say the Speaker Pelosi, in a bizarre way, her hand may be strengthened, because as you have a narrow majority, people are going to trust the leader here. And her negotiating against Trump has been incredibly well. I would just say there's one thing about there's going to be an analysis here. In a red state like Florida, the minimum wage passed. In a blue state like Illinois, the progressive income tax went down. In a very blue state in California, the gig employee stuff and the affirmative action went down. So actually, voters are telling you a lot of different things in red and blue states that are not consistent with the colors that they are. So I would just say that Joe Biden's kind of what he was attacked for being more reformer is, given that you have a divided government from Pennsylvania Avenue to Pennsylvania Avenue, may be the one person who can steer progressive politics into reality.
You want to jump in here, and then I'll go to Sarah.
You know, just quickly, I mean, I want to talk about the fact that in Florida, that initiative was pushed. When we talk about progressive ideas, we went on them. I think one of the challenges that we had, and I want to reflect on the Senate, because we had a lot of money going into moderate Senate candidates who ultimately didn't win, because we didn't talk about issues in places where we actually could have won on issues. And so I think that's where, particularly when you think about the Progressive Caucus growing on Nancy Pelosi's side, we're now larger than we were before, the largest values-based caucus in the House. How can you start to talk about those issues? How can Joe Biden start to work with the Senate Republicans to get some of those through?
Sarah Fagan, Mitch McConnell's caught in the middle here. Does he see his role as stopping Joe Biden or finding ways to work with him?
I think he will want to work with him. I think that will be his instinct, is to start to legislate again. Not much has happened in Congress. But to Yvette's point, there is no doubt in my mind that Bernie Sanders, being the standard bearer, closely being the standard bearer of the Democratic Party, certainly the standard bearer of the progressive movement, over the course of the last 5-6 years, is the reason that Republicans did so well. They rejected that progressive policy positions. And what Democrats always said to Republicans like me through the course of this campaign was, don't worry, Joe Biden is a moderate. Don't worry, Joe Biden is a centrist. He's going to govern like that. You guys should come over to our side, reject Trump. And if that's true, he's going to get the cabinet he wants, because Mitch McConnell is not going to allow anybody through the Senate confirmation process that, you know, people like Rahm and Heidi, they're more likely to be in the cabinet today than they would have been had Democrats taken control.
Heidi, I don't know if you're going to be asked to be in the cabinet. Heidi Heidkamp, but you did serve in the Senate with Mitch McConnell as a centrist Democrat from North Dakota. How do you assess the politics here if indeed Biden does become president, Mitch McConnell remains leader of the Senate?
I think you have to look at 2022 and understand that we've got a Senate race in Pennsylvania, a Senate race in Wisconsin, and there's a lot of room to move people, Ohio even. I think Mitch is going to worry about maintaining his leadership into 2022, and I think that Biden needs to worry about whether he's going to retain the House. And so there's a lot of dynamics in all of this. But I have to tell you, I don't think that Senate candidates lost because they were too moderate and not progressive enough. The two we picked up that we know for sure are definitely moderates. And I think going forward, that moderate message is going to be the message that is going to win back blue-collar workers in states like Ohio. So I think you can expect a lot of progressive policies like minimum wage, a lot of bread and butter, as my friend Barbara Mikulski used to say, the macaroni and cheese issues. You're going to hear a lot about those. Healthcare, macaroni and cheese, economic issues, and those are what's going to propel us to victory in 2022.
And Mary Bruce, you cover Congress every day. This is going to be met immediately. This issue met immediately because there's huge need now for a coronavirus, a COVID relief bill. There hasn't been one. It was negotiated for several weeks during the campaign between Nancy Pelosi and the president's team, who were at odds with the Senate Republicans.
And I think Democrats, because they were holding out hope and were very optimistic that they were going to see a real shift in power in Washington, thought that they would soon be able to get through a kind of bigger deal that they've been looking for this whole time. That is now going to face a much more uphill battle. It has been months, George, months, as millions of Americans have been in really desperate need of relief from Washington. And we have just seen the two sides not able to get on the same page at all. And it's really, you know, fundamental disagreements here. Republicans want a much more smaller, more targeted deal. Democrats are looking for bigger, sweeping package here. And of course, we did throughout all of this see President Trump at points really throw a wrench in these negotiations. But now I think, you know, Republicans will certainly feel emboldened to go for that smaller deal that they have been looking for this entire time. But they know that they have to do something, and they have to do something quickly. And, you know, the hope that things would look very different after this election certainly, I think, are changing everyone's calculus very quickly up on Capitol Hill.
No question about that, John Carl. I guess this will be met during a potential lame duck session as well, and complicated politics of whether to do something now or later.
Hugely complicated politics, but if the Senate, in fact, will remain in Republican control, it's essentially the same political calculus on Capitol Hill. Just the question is who the president is, and of course the runoff elections in Georgia that will ultimately determine the control of the Senate in all likelihood are on January 5th. So we're going to have a very strange lame duck period. I got to tell you, though, George, Mitch McConnell once told me many years ago that I'll never forget the exact quote. He said, "I'm a big fan of divided government." Divided government. That's where a power broker like Mitch McConnell can really play that power broker role. This, in some ways, is potentially, you know, if Biden is able to hang on to this lead and become the next president, it puts Mitch McConnell in a very powerful position. He can block all of the things that he truly doesn't want to see. Big tax increases, you know, big Green New Deal style environmental regulation. But there will be things that have to get done, and Mitch McConnell is going to absolutely have a seat at the table. And if it's as a narrow majority as it looks like it will be, you know, perhaps 51 votes, 51 Republican seats in the Senate, to have a working majority, Mitch McConnell's actually on many of those issues going to have a coalition with Democrats, because he's got some people in his caucus like Rand Paul and Ted Cruz, Mike Lee. He's got people that are going to play a very hard line on issues, especially in issues of spending. And likely so I think it's going to be a very interesting time in Congress. Congress is going to be where the action is. And likely a lot of people in his caucus are going to be looking at perhaps running for president as well, if indeed it's an open seat on the Republican side. I want to go back to Nevada right now. Matt Gutman is there, and I know, Matt, officials in Clark County have held a press conference. What do we learn?
George, it's actually very surprising. Everybody expected the Clark County ballots, the mail-in ballots that were received on Election Day or after, to be tabulated by now. But in that press conference just inside the Clark County Election Center, you can see a Trump protester behind me. The spokesperson just said that they don't expect the bulk of those ballots to actually be tabulated until Saturday or Sunday. So on the one hand, they said that there is no evidence of any improper ballot, which is going to mollify people who are concerned about the legality of these elections and whether there was any fraud involved. On the other hand, delaying the outcome, or at least extending it until the weekend or through the weekend, is only going to feed the conspiracy theories. People screaming behind me, the allegations of multiple ballots, of deceased people voting. It is not a very good thing here. And again, when we're talking about 63,000 votes in Clark County, the margin between Biden and Trump right now is less than 12,000 votes. It's less than a single %. So we don't know what is actually in those 63,000 ballots. Again, Biden's camp believes that it heavily favors them, that they're probably 2-to-1 favorites here in Clark County. But the fact that it's going to be delayed for that long is probably not good news here, especially since they are concerned about security. They say the Election Commission is beefing up security here because there have been several incidents at this electoral office as well, and that's something they're very concerned about right now.
Let me take that to Pierre Thomas. We're seeing these protests in Arizona. We're seeing the protests in Arizona and Nevada increasingly. How big of a concern is it to federal officials right now?
Well, right now, George, again, the key is, you know, everyone needs to be patient and let these votes be counted. But as we wait, the people on the fringe and some people who are just frustrated because they think their person is losing and or whatever that situation is are likely to show up. And when tensions mount, law enforcement officials always get concerned. We think about what the Secretary of State of Arizona described to you, George, where deputies, Sheriff's Department officials had to come to the polling place where the votes were being counted in order to assure people that everything was okay. Imagine counting those votes and knowing that there are people outside to the point where you had to have law enforcement show up. So this is the concern. Hopefully these votes can be counted in an efficient way where people can get the results. But as we have to wait, these tensions will rise, George.
Okay, Pierre, thanks very much. Tom Yamas, a universe of about 60,000, 70,000 votes out there. Let's take a look at where they're coming from, where they could possibly be coming from.
Right. Let's just see first how Joe Biden's doing in Clark County. This is Las Vegas. He's tracking similar to Hillary Clinton did 4 years ago. But, you know, we talk a lot about Clark County. It's the biggest county. I want to talk about Washoe because this is where Joe Biden really overperformed. He's at 50% there. Hillary Clinton was at 46.4. This was a very close race 4 years ago. It was decided only by 23,000 votes. So it was close 4 years ago. It's really close right now. You also can't talk about Nevada and Clark County and Las Vegas without talking about COVID. It was the state that had the highest unemployment rate. It's a state where COVID ravages the community here, both physically and economically. And right now, tourism, which is 70% of the economy in Las Vegas, is still hurting. So I want to see how this story is going to end, George, because this will be a good referendum on both the president and Biden's plans on how to handle COVID. Nevada usually picks the winner, right? Going back to 1912, it almost always picks the winner. One exception, 2016, George.
Okay, David Muir.
Really interesting. And in 2016, as Tom points out, Hillary Clinton won by 2.4 percentage points. So this is 1% or less. I know we still have these absentee ballots, these mail-in ballots to count. So this could grow for Biden and it could grow for President Trump. A couple other things. Take a look, and we were talking to Ram about this earlier. One of the main storylines emerging from this election on day 3 are the independents that Biden has done so well. 47-43, not as quite a gap there in Nevada as we've seen the rest of the country. A couple other groups that are very important constituencies here. Latinos in the state. Trump has gained ground among Latino voters, according to the exit polls at least. 29%. Hillary Clinton did better 4 years ago, according to the exit polls. Trump also narrowly flipped seniors in Nevada. Clinton won seniors by 5 points in 2016. So far, Trump, according to the exit polls, leads Biden by about 4 to 5 points. So these demographics, similar when it comes to Latinos as what we saw in Florida, particularly Miami-Dade. But the Biden camp hopeful that as these early votes come in, they'll start to gain ground, get closer to what Hillary was able to accomplish 4 years ago there.
Thank you. Nate Silver, everything depends on where these votes are coming. We know that the Clark County votes had broken heavily for Joe Biden in the days leading to the election.
So John Ralston, who's the guru of Nevada politics, says he sees no path left for Trump in Nevada. He's seen enough to say that Biden's lead may increase. It probably won't decrease, but it seems, I mean, I agree with him. If I agree with John Ralston on everything about Nevada, but these ballots are very blue so far in Clark County. Clark County is about 2/3 of the population of the state, so it's hard to see where Trump will get enough votes to overtake Joe Biden.
I think you're right to praise him. I was following his blog every 4 years, but in the days leading into this election, he does an incredibly granular look at all of the votes coming in day by day in Clark County, and he's generally called these elections dead on. So I don't know if he can definitely take it to the bank, but he has been right before. That is for sure. Okay, Nate. I want to go to North Carolina now. Janae Norman is in Raleigh. Janae.
Hey, George, yeah, President Trump's still up by about 76,000 votes. We have learned today that there are just over 40,000 outstanding provisional ballots, and then there are those 116,000 outstanding mail-in ballots. And we have learned more about the demographics of those outstanding mail-in ballots. The breakdown by party, Democrats and independents each account for just under 40%. Republicans account for just over 20%. So with those numbers, Joe Biden would need to win not only all of those Democrat voters, but also all of the independents and even some of the Republicans. That would be tough for him to do. Not completely impossible, but it would be tough. And with the November 12th deadline here in North Carolina, this is one of those states, as people are questioning, why could the vote take so long to get those final numbers? North Carolina has one of the latest deadlines in the country. State officials here wanted to make sure everyone who requested a mail-in ballot had plenty of time to make sure that that is able to get back to them. And as long as it's been postmarked on or before election night, and that, of course, includes overseas and military voters, as long as they were postmarked on or before election night, they have until next week to arrive, and they'll be counted on the 12th or 13th, and that's when we'll have those final results.
Okay, Janae, thanks very much. We actually have a North Carolina official with us right now, Josh Stein, the Attorney General of North Carolina. General Stein, thanks for joining us right now. Give us the latest from your perspective on where things stand with the count. What should we be expecting in the coming days?
I think the description was very accurate. About half, usually, of the provisional ballots that are cast, that 42,000, 44,000 provisional ballots, end up being discarded as being ineligible for some reason. That's the historic data. So we don't anticipate all of those provisional ballots being added to the total. And then the 120,000 mail-in ballots, a number of those people actually cast their votes on election day. We won't know exactly how many for another day or two. And then there's no obligation that anyone who requested a mail-in ballot necessarily send it in. So the total number of votes outstanding is going to be substantially less than the 160,000 if you add them all up together.
And how has your process gone overall? I know you had tremendous amounts of vote coming in early, well over 90% of the 2016 turnout.
Just massive turnout. Something like 75% of eligible voters or registered voters cast their ballot this year, which is without any precedent in North Carolina. Just a really strong turnout. And frankly, that turnout just demonstrated how incredibly politically competitive / politically divided we are as a state. You know, we elected President Trump and our Democratic Governor Roy Cooper, assuming the numbers still hold for Trump. It's not final yet. But the point is we're just a 50-50 state, and I can speak with expertise on that, leading in my race by 50.1% of the vote. And it makes it incumbent upon all elected officials in North Carolina to really open their ears and hearts to the other side so we can try to achieve some meaningful changes for the people.
I'm glad you said that, because we were having a discussion here in the studio before you came on about what that could mean in Washington if former Vice President Biden goes on to win, facing a Republican Senate. How is that going to work? Fill out a little more for us how it's worked for you in the state of North Carolina, about as deeply split a state as you can have.
Well, I don't want to make it a panacea. It definitely is challenging because there are fundamental differences between the parties. But there have been many instances where we find areas of agreement, you know, tackling the opioid epidemic, passing laws against overprescribing. North Carolina had one of the largest backlogs of untested sexual assault kits in the country. We worked together to develop a tracking system and raise the funds, get an appropriation from the legislature to eliminate that backlog. So it's about finding those areas of commonality and trying to develop a good working relationship and mutual respect so that on the issues that we differ, it doesn't have to dissolve into acrimony.
Easier on the state level than in Washington?
Yeah, not super easy anywhere, but it has to be, look, we have to have that commitment. We will never get there if we don't have that commitment on both sides. And that's what I'm trying to do, how I've tried to serve as Attorney General, and I think that's a lesson learned well for all of America.
General Stein, thanks for your time today. Ron, let me take this to you. You served in the White House, you served in Congress, you're mayor of Chicago. Is it easier at the local level?
Yes. I mean, it is.
Why?
Because at the local level, this is the government that is most immediate and intimate in how people live their lives. Where does a traffic light go? Where is a playground? What are the hours at your library? When you think about the government, where you send your schools, where you live, how you get to work, what are the things that a city provides you, that then, not that ideology doesn't count. We raised the minimum wage. We made pre-K universal, full day free. But the government that touches you is a government that has to deliver services. Sometimes, and I respect Washington because it's easier to have a Washington working with you than against you, Washington for the rest of America can look like Disneyland on the Potomac. It's all just one giant argument. And so I do think, I think the Vice President's pragmatic approach, understanding how to get progressive policies done rather than just talk about them, will serve him well. And he knows McConnell in personal relationships get discounted in politics, but it's a huge
Well, he was
factor.
just explaining it matters in the state.
It does, and so local government is intimate and immediate. That means ideology is less important, and results are measured with a heightened, with a greater sense of value, and therefore ideology, I want to say, get cast aside. Your perspectives matter, and you got to work at it, and you see these people. You know, and you live with these people in a more...
Sounds like you're saying you don't have the luxury of...
you don't.
Succumbing to
I mean, I do think that there's one thing about Mitch McConnell will say this, you know, his ideology is power. And so I know Biden's going to know, I mean, it's not a left or right. I mean, I do think it's definitely right, but it's about power. He will look at that 2022 map and say, I can't just be Grim Reaper anymore. And so he'll try to work and he'll say, here's the price for working with me.
Matt Dowd, weigh in on this.
Well, to me, one of the things I want to emphasize is that the millions of Americans out there that are waiting for this election to be finalized, they're basically in understanding of this. Tell us who won, and I remember this from 2000 and 2004. Tell us who won, and then basically the majority of the country is going to say, okay, I got it. I know who won the majority, whether it's Joe Biden or Donald Trump in the end of this, and then they're going to say, I guess I got to cut my lawn tomorrow. I'm going to go get pancakes at the local cafe. This is going to work out. I mean, keep in mind, we're talking about the divisiveness in our country today in this election and what the result may be. George Bush lost the popular vote in 2000, won Florida by virtue of a Supreme Court decision, 5-4 partisanship, by 550 votes or so, and took office. And the first thing George W. Bush did was work out a deal with the most liberal senator, Ted Kennedy, to pass the No Child Left Behind and on education reform. So the country, I think, there's going to be elements on both sides of this that are going to be angry at certain days, but the majority of the country is going to watch this unfold as they're watching it unfold today, George. They're going to see who won the Electoral College. They're going to observe what happens, and then they're going to go, okay, it's time to go about my business. Why don't you guys go about your business and fix the problems?
I think that's a fair point. Tara Moran, he brought up George W. Bush, and it is true and fair that George W. Bush went for that education program before 9/11 hit, but then 9/11 did hit, and he responded to that crisis that made him even more popular. And I wonder, given that history, if the president missed a bet here at the beginning of the COVID crisis. It seemed like a perfect opportunity to say, here is something that is hitting us, whether it's from the outside or not, but we are all in this together. We are going to fight it together.
It's a great point. You would have thought that the presence of an external threat, an enemy, this virus, as happened in 9/11, would bring the country together, that we'd fight it together. Instead, we decided, with the president's encouragement, to handle this coronavirus through the lens of our divisive politics. And we see the results here. And it was a missed opportunity for leadership for President Trump, but you couldn't have expected that kind of leadership out of him. I mean, he is not a deal maker with anyone who's not going to play ball with him the way he wants to. And I think one of the lessons of this election for Republicans who were counseling him, please don't run on these divisive issues. There was no platform. There was no policy, no kitchen table policy. It was more Trump. That's what it was. And the lesson of this election for Republicans is be as Trumpy as you can.
And Lindsay, it's a sense that we learn that leadership has consequences as well. You were talking about this yesterday. Even how people respond to the crisis, whether or not to wear a mask, how to talk about it, they take the lesson, they take the message from the top.
And this is so important because playing out in the background of all of this, I think that many of us are forgetting just how many people that for 2 days in a row we've exceeded 1,000 cases of coronavirus. And this idea of the jobs, the lives versus the livelihoods continues to loom large. Though I do believe that we saw in exit polls that it was just over 60%. I think it was about 62% of Americans who agreed we should be wearing masks. Still seems relatively low considering the science out there.
Sarah?
One of the things I'm struck by just watching this play out and considering what a strong night Republicans had on Tuesday is if President Trump would have dialed it back, maybe even only 25%, we wouldn't be having this conversation right now. He would have been reelected. I mean, this is such an incredibly close race. And, you know, at every opportunity, he just takes it to a level, you know, where he calls seniors to take a step back. I mean, I think ultimately seniors are probably going to have cost him this election, and had he dialed his tone back, even 25 or 50%, who knows if this would be over now.
Martha Raddatz.
It really does seem like the president missed a chance, especially with COVID. I think if the president really had just come out, and Georgia said that, and said everybody should wear a mask, it's just what we have to do, things really might look different today. I also continue to reach out to people, and his comments about fraud. There's a man in Ohio who is the staunchest Trump supporter you've ever seen, Lynn Kincaid, an older man in Ohio, who told me, I said, is there anything President Trump could do that would dissuade you from voting for him again? He said, absolutely not. To me, he walks on water. Well, that man today, Lynn Kincaid, apparently Trump has sunk in the bottom of the river with his comments about fraud. He does not like what the president said about fraud. He does not believe it. He's still hoping that President Trump wins, but he also said he has no right to claim he has won already. And that may just be anecdotal, but if you look back even at our exit polls, 87% of Americans said they are confident that their state will count votes accurately, and half of Americans said they are very confident of that, George.
And that voting is continuing right now. Let's take a look again at the state of Georgia, where the vote is going through the afternoon. It's gotten closer in the last several hours. Pulling it up right there, you see 49-50 Joe Biden, just about 14,000 votes behind President Trump at this point. Let's go back to Steve Osunsami. Steve, what more are we learning this afternoon about how this is going to unfold?
Well, Fulton County has now come out and said that they're done. In an emotional news conference, they announced that they have counted all of their votes. They have turned them in. They've got about 7,000 votes that are going to be added to the vote totals that are not currently included in the total. And, George, since we first talked, the lead for the president has fallen by almost 1,000 votes, down to 13,540 votes, according to the state's website. And I want to point something out. One of the things that is going to be the new fight is over something called a cured ballot. That's becoming an issue here in Georgia. The Fulton County turned in about 1,200 cured ballots, and those are ballots where the signatures either didn't match or the person used a check mark instead of filling out the oval. That debate is going to be playing out large here because this vote is going to be so close. In Gwinnett County, which is just to the north of Fulton, where I am right now, they're also having this fight as well. There are people staring at these ballots, trying to determine voter intent, and that's going to matter more and more as the lead shrinks.
So, Steve, when you're saying that the lead shrunk by about 1,000 before the Fulton County votes were included in the system.
That's correct. The Fulton County votes have not been included in that total yet, we don't believe. The Secretary of State is still saying that there are about 50,000 absentee ballots out there. We're not sure if that number is correct based on what we're hearing from the counties that are reporting slightly different numbers. But this is definitely going to be an extremely tight race, and it may actually be decided by some of those votes that are being stared at right now, where election boards are trying to figure out what the intent of those voters are. There are also military ballots that are still coming in. I think that the boards have the ballots have until Friday to come in, but all of these votes are going to matter a lot more as this lead gets tighter and tighter for the president.
Okay, Steve, thanks. Let me go to Dan Abrams for more on this issue of cured ballots and determining the intent of a voter. When judges look at issues like this, who gets the benefit of the doubt?
Well, look, the voter does, right? You want to try and figure out what the intent was of the voter, and depending on how clear it is or not clear it is, you want to have votes count. That's the presumption. But I will tell you, when I heard him talking about these cured ballots, this was an issue, or a similar issue was raised in Florida in 2018. Remember, there were allegations of voter fraud in Florida. Two sort of big picture issues that are now relevant in this election. One was, as the votes came in, the Democrat there, Bill Nelson, increased his numbers vis-a-vis Rick Scott. And there were a lot of people saying, wait a sec, where did these votes come from? How is he catching up so much in the vote? There were allegations that, again, this sort of notion that someone had stuffed the ballots or something. They created a commission there to investigate it. And in the end, they found that there was no voter fraud. But one of the key issues there related to what were called cure affidavits there. And there was an alteration that had been made for some people with a deadline. And there was a question, oh, my goodness, they changed the deadline here, and this must be fraud. And they investigated it, and they found that there was a perfectly acceptable explanation for why it had happened in the state of Florida. And I say this to say that this was led by Republicans, this commission there, and the concern was that Democrats had done something wrong. We just have to be careful when we hear about issues that arise in a state like Georgia, about these sort of random cure affidavits and ballots.
They arise in every election.
Right, every election, and issues arise. The only time there's a problem is if you can show that the intent was to cheat. And that's not what they found in Florida. And as of now, we have no evidence that
Sarah?
I've been on the ground in a number of recounts, and my experience has been 90-some% of these situations are human errors. Somebody goes to lunch, they ask somebody else to move their pile of ballots, they forget, all of a sudden ballots get found. That is common. It does happen, though, sometimes, rarely, but sometimes, that partisan people working in elections in a close race where 4,000 votes are at stake make a bad decision. It happens.
That definitely happens. It's harder to happen in a process like this, a national election, where
But what does a bad decision mean? I mean, let's be clear. I mean, because what exactly is that bad decision that could literally determine the outcome that is voter fraud, right?
Yeah, sure. You know, Ram and I are counters. We're sitting at a table, and
Can you leave me out of this subject at this point? I would like to.
And it's
is my lawyer here?
It's clear that somebody, you know, wrote outside the lines or made the wrong check mark, and you know, one of the partisans says, no, throw that out. You know, and partisan influence does come into this process when it's extremely close.
But you would agree that
4,000 times.
But you would agree. No, but you would agree that.
I said 90+% of the time is human error when there's these things.
The two things. One, the basis is to make sure whatever the voter intended gets heard. That's A.
Yeah.
B, with all the eyes and everybody watching, the ability for nefarious act in that room is so. I mean, it is like a medical. It's like a surgery. Everybody's gowned up and masked up. It is impossible to do, and that's a kid from Chicago talking. Okay.
Terry Moran, we have a ruling out of Michigan.
We do. A state court judge in Michigan has rejected the Trump campaign's effort to stop the count there and give them access to ballots that were already counted because they said they weren't close enough to see what was going on. And they had one of these allegations. They had an allegation that someone was being told to change the dates. The judge said it was just hearsay and that the evidence was lacking. That's been a problem. And sort of more generally, the Supreme Court has said that the Constitution and our laws don't guarantee us a perfect election. The goal is a true election that reflects the will of the people and fair, that everybody gets a fair shot. But all these votes, all these different ways of counting, you aren't going to get a perfect election. The question is, is there real evidence? And the judge in this Michigan case just said, what do you got? You got hearsay. Get out of here. And is it widespread enough to make it?
And for it to be determinative, right, you still have to end up in a situation like Florida in 2000, where it came down to one state, a 500-vote difference.
That's right. And now we are hearing that there's a federal judge in Washington, D.C., who is ordering the post office to start sweeping the post offices looking for ballots, because 700 ballots postmarked the day before or the day of the election, postmarked in time, were discovered in Philadelphia. And you know, we're looking at Pennsylvania. Could it be a few hundred votes? Probably not. But 700 votes, now you're getting into Florida territory, which was only about 500. So get the votes delivered, but you know, there's no evidence of widespread fraud.
Let's see it. But I actually want to go back to Georgia, because we were talking about the Georgia votes. And let's bring that board back up right now. And Tom, let's look at, as this is getting tighter and tighter and tighter, where the vote is still left to come in.
Right. So to answer your question, it's the Atlanta metro region, which you see a lot of blue here. But, George, we also got some new reporting overnight that there are also votes out in Savannah, which is another very blue area of Georgia. You can see there's not a lot of blue on this map. It's pretty much concentrated to this area of Atlanta, the middle portion of Georgia, and then the Savannah area as well. I do want to show you one data point, though, because we're talking about early and absentee voting here in Georgia. Joe Biden has the lead. Donald Trump has the lead in the state. But when it comes to that early vote right now, and 99% of it is estimated to be in, Joe Biden is on top there. And that's why the Biden campaign thinks the trend lines favor them going into this count, George.
Okay, thank you. Nate Silver, when we started this broadcast, you said it looks like Georgia's heading into recount territory. As these new votes have come in, does it tell you anything else?
I mean, you might have a small edge for Biden. I think if he were to win Georgia, it would still be narrow enough that it would go to a recount most likely. But let me give you one data point. In Bryan County, Georgia, southeast part of the state, Trump won that county by 43 points in 2016. Joe Biden won the mail vote counted today by 15 points. So even in red counties, you can have a very, very blue mail absentee vote. And that's why with every passing turn, Joe Biden is gaining ground.
In the mail votes, which are being counted right now. Nate Silver, thanks very much. Eva Pilgrim, you have some news from Pennsylvania.
That's right. It looks like we will have a pretty clear decision here in Pennsylvania, potentially by the end of the day today. We are hearing from officials at the state level here in Pennsylvania that they are expecting the majority of those votes to be counted here in Pennsylvania by the end of the day today. And that doesn't seem like a wild thing to think of, right? Because we already got 92% of the votes in at this point. Trump leads really by a narrow margin, about 115,000 votes. They've got 560,000 votes to still
get in by the end of the day today. And the Biden camp is feeling really good about those numbers because most of those votes are mail-in ballots. Those ballots go overwhelmingly in his favor. A lot of these outstanding votes at this point are from Democratic strongholds, Philadelphia, the areas around Philadelphia. They're waiting for those numbers to finally be in. And Joe Biden needs to win about 60% of those remaining votes. He's been trending well above that, George.
Eva Pilgrim, thanks very much. I want to bring Rick Klein, our political director, back. Rick, take people inside a boiler room, a campaign boiler room, and how they know what's in these votes that are still out there.
Yeah, there's two reasons for the Biden campaign to be confident about these votes. One is the geography, because you know that they are primarily urban votes. Philadelphia, in particular, a lot of vote outstanding from Philadelphia. Also, its immediate suburbs, Pittsburgh as well. And the second is the type of votes we're talking about. These are early votes. The Democrats were adamant. They wanted their people to get out early, and that has been borne out in the numbers in state after state, including Pennsylvania's neighbors up there in the upper Midwest, the Great Lakes region, Michigan, Wisconsin. These are Biden votes overwhelmingly. And you see the pattern play out across the country. The Biden campaign very confident that not only will they overcome that gap, but that it may be a significant one. You could see a larger margin even than the one that we saw in Wisconsin.
And to put some numbers on it, you wouldn't expect to see these kinds of numbers in an American election, but we're talking in some of these areas when the mail vote comes in 70, 80% for Joe Biden.
Exactly. This is not like a normal election where you see the number splits and you think, well, maybe a 60-40. You're right. 3/4 plus of the vote in many of these areas are Biden because of those two factors. You're really adding up those two factors to find these overwhelming majorities. That's been the kind of margins they've seen elsewhere in the country. And look, if people had voted under other circumstances, those numbers would have already been tabulated. And Pennsylvania officials, George, they've been telling us for months that this would happen. This was the state of the law there. These votes were always going to take longer to count.
Nate Silver? Nate, I know you wanted to weigh in on this as well.
So I'm having trouble hearing you, but the Secretary of State said on CNN that 550,000 ballots are still left to be counted in Pennsylvania. That's on the high side of estimates. That's good news for Joe Biden because he's winning. The ballots are being counted now by a wide margin.
Okay, and Sarah Fag, I wanted to come to you on this as well. I remember at the beginning of the summer, I guess it was as the president was starting this campaign against mail-in voting, you saw Republican members of Congress, Republican state officials, Republican senators saying, not so fast, be careful what you wish for.
Well, exactly, and one of the things that is interesting about mail-in voting is the PR aspect of what's playing out here, is that, you know, we're in a very, very close election, but the momentum is going to Biden. And so even though Democrats did this in part because of COVID and making sure that their voters would actually participate in the election, the PR aspect of it now looks like Biden is having the momentum. He looks presidential in his statements, and it's really working to the Democrats' favor, where the president is on the defensive. He's looking for an avenue to win. He's talking about voter fraud. He's being rebuked for it. And it's just hard to change the dynamic, you know, when you're behind.
I would say one is, I mean, we all done recounts. You want to go into it up because somebody has to prove you wrong, and it's hard to find those numbers. Number two, there's a pattern. The president came out throwing so many things against the wall legally. The judges now have kind of, I don't want to say, there's a group think going on here, you can feel. Yeah. Each judge is starting to rule against here, and that starts to set a pattern. Like, they, you know, judges are in robes, but they can read public opinion too. And they're going to see this as the country wants some closure, some end up. Not that they're going to go overboard legally, but they're going to look at this with a skewed eye, and they're going to see this more as bringing politics in the court, and they don't want to be dragged into this process. So those two are also working against the president.
I think a smarter strategic play for the president here would be to focus on Pennsylvania. You know, doing frivolous lawsuits where there's one observer who says, you know, we saw fraud is, to Rahm's point, it's a very good one, which is that you've got to control the narrative nationally. And there is a legal case in Pennsylvania. It's going to be very difficult not to count those 250,000 votes. They're actual voters and they voted. But the state law said that they had to be received by Election Day. The legislature tried to change it. They didn't change it. The Supreme Court and the state changed it. And, you know, many would argue that's unconstitutional.
I think it depends on the margin in Pennsylvania. It depends on if he can hold on to his leads in Georgia as well. I think that would determine whether it's a viable strategy.
Donald Trump is hurting his PR strategy relative to Pennsylvania.
Well, I want folks to think about what Democrats worked against all odds in a system that was constantly shifted by Donald Trump himself, taking over the post office. Folks who were organizing all across the state, all across the country, were telling people mail in, and then all of a sudden the post office started to slow down. Wait, hold your ballot, take it in person. I mean, can you imagine the fact that we're winning significantly?
That's just not true, Yvette.
It is I watched it, I worked on it, it is very true. We actually had to tell people 3 weeks ahead of time in Pennsylvania to go take their ballots in person because we were worried that this shift was going to happen and people actually cast their ballots a week before. First of all, let's just say this. Many of the votes that are being counted right now in Pennsylvania were cast before Donald Trump's people's votes were cast in person. So why would they not count even if they were received after the election? But these are folks who may have actually be in post offices and they should be counted because they were cast legally and validly. And so if he wants to make a war of Pennsylvania, which I hope he doesn't, I think he's going to lose.
Let me just get this straight, though, which is there's no fraud happening around the country. We all agree with that. However, there was fraud in the post office by Republicans. I mean, give me a break.
Okay, I want to move back to Mary Bruce now. Mary, so we're expecting Pennsylvania perhaps to come in by the end of the day. Georgia is getting closer to a decision. If either one of those states is formally projected by news organizations, will we see Joe Biden come out tonight and declare victory?
It is our understanding that when they are prepared to declare victory, that yes, he will come out, that you will see, you know, what we thought or what they were planning earlier in this week in terms of what we think of as more of a traditional acceptance speech. They have not given a sense yet of when exactly that's going to happen or what state is their trigger. But if they feel confident that they've hit that 270 number, and of course, remember, they are very confident they have won Wisconsin and Michigan. So if they take Pennsylvania, then that's it. And I believe you would then, my very strong suspicion is that then you would see Joe Biden coming out and formally accepting a nomination.
John Carl, that same question to you. I know you had said earlier that they're putting a lot of hope, the Trump campaign, a lot of hopes on Arizona and hoping they can overtake Joe Biden there. But if one of those two big states falls today to Joe Biden, what do you expect from the president?
I expect him to keep fighting, George. He's not gonna give this one up for a while. It's going to take time. It's going to take a lot of pressure. Somebody very close to the president who is actually advising his legal team on all of this asked me a question a few hours ago. Who can go to the president, who has the stature to go to the president, who he truly would listen to and tell him it is over? And then that person, with seriousnness, answered his own question and said, maybe Sean Hannity. It's not clear that it's not like he's going to listen to a Mitch McConnell or listen to networks. Even you know, Fox News has been ahead of virtually every other news organization and already calling projecting Arizona for Joe Biden. Even a Fox News coming out and projecting the presidency for Joe Biden. That's not going to change the president's mind. He's going to fight on this for a while.
Do you think he even knows yet what he's going to do?
I don't think he knows. He goes by his guts. I was told by somebody who spoke to him, who was with him late Tuesday night as he came out and did his events. Made his statement at the White House talking about the disenfranchisement of his supporters and described his mood as very, very bad, very foul, very upset about what he's seeing, getting a sense of where it was going even then. And at that point, if you remember, he was actually still up as the votes were being tabulated in Michigan and in Wisconsin and, of course, in Pennsylvania. So it's only gotten worse for him now.
The votes are still being counted. We're going to return to our regular program right now. Election coverage continues on ABC News Live. And, of course, we will come back with any new developments in Pennsylvania, Georgia, any of those key states. Have a good afternoon.
Next on Midday Live, the wait continues. 2 days after Election Day, we still don't know who will be the next president of the United States. President Trump has narrowed the gap